Welcome to the Unlist. Today we're talking about mint in fragrances. Mint is a note that has had some periods in history where it could be commonly found in a lot of men's toiletries, a lot of aftershaves and colognes, things like that. And then it's gone out of fashion for a while and doesn't typically get featured. Doesn't mean it's not in fragrances, it just means that it's not prominently featured. And then it just comes out of the woodwork and returns. We start seeing more mainstream or more obvious displays of mint in men's fragrances, and then just like that, gone again. So it's almost like it has a tidal effect where it's in fashion, out of fashion, and then just back and forth. What's interesting about mint is that if you talk to people who aren't really into fragrances as a hobby, they're not really collectors, they're not watching YouTube, they're not hanging out on base notes or Fragrantica, they're not part of the community. They just buy stuff that's sold to them, or samples they get from magazines, or I don't know, just however the average person these days seems to really get a fragrance. They tend to be kind of indifferent about mint. Like, if mint is in the fragrance and it makes the fragrance smell good, then yeah, sure, they like it. They're not really super concerned. But if mint is not in the fragrance, then same sort of thing. Like, okay, well, whatever. Like, they're not concerned about individual materials, really. But then that switches when you start talking to people who are in the online fragrance community. You start talking to collectors and people who care about relevance and compliments and what are the optics of me wearing this fragrance, da 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 da. Am I going to do numbers on TikTok? Are all my friends going to give me attaboys or whatever? That whole shit, right? The compliment bros and stuff. You start to find that attitudes actually change, and there's a bit of stigma. Like, people in the community have a stigma with mint. They see mint as medicinal, or reminding them of toothpaste, or other functional fragrance callbacks, and they don't want that. They want to avoid that because, I guess, like I said, when you're into the psychological aspect of collecting and wearing fragrance, a lot of times people are looking for something that's going to elevate them in the eyes of their peers, right? Their fellow fraghead. And if you wear a fragrance that has mint in it, then it's just a very common functional note, right? It's just like you don't see too many guys boasting about wearing lavender in their fragrances. It's almost like, in fact, I've heard people complain about obvious lavender notes because they think it makes the fragrance feel dated or something, because all the old shave creams were heavily scented with lavender, da 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 da. So you see, that's the problem, is mint ends up being a very controversial note, but only to a small number of people. To the nerds, to the collectors, to the fragheads, mint is very controversial to those folks. But to the general public, they don't care. Granddad's been wearing Aquavelva for 60 years, right? Uncle Ted's been wearing Skin Bracer, or if you're from Italy, it's Proraso, right? Don't care. They don't care. So it's a strange dichotomy there, where the average Joe doesn't have a problem with mint, but the people who put their batch codes of Aventus online, and the people who take screen caps of their boxes and look for irregularities and whatever, those are the ones that flip out when they learn that a fragrance has mint in it. Oh, it's going to smell like toothpaste. Oh, no, it's going to smell like air freshener. Oh, no, it's going to smell like my chewing gum. And everyone else is just kind of like, So, with that out of the way, my opinion. Well, for me, mint is like any other material. It's like lavender, it's like rose, like sandalwood, oak moss, bergamot, da 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 da. It's all about how it's executed, right? There are good mint fragrances, and then there are bad mint fragrances, and I don't have the bad ones. At least in my opinion, I don't have the bad ones. You may disagree. And I just thought, hey, I've done these unlist videos about different genres and other notes. Let's do one about mint. So first things first, not all mint fragrances have the same kind of mint in them, but I think that sort of goes without saying, right? You guys kind of figure that. There's peppermint, there's spearmint. Wintergreen isn't exactly mint, but it's adjacent. And camphor is also not exactly mint either, but it's adjacent. So sometimes you get a camphor note that's actual camphor and not a byproduct of patchouli. It's just actual camphor. Sometimes you get, something like a spearmint note, or you get a peppermint note, or you get a blended sort of combination mint note, depending. And sometimes the mint can be sweet because it's paired with vanilla, so it feels more of like a confectionery mint, more like a Starlight mint or mint ice cream. Other times, the mint is very green and dry and fresh, very mentholated feeling, medicinal, and it can impart a different sort of property to the fragrance. It all depends on what the perfumer and I guess the brand wants with that mint note. So, now, I mentioned aftershaves, so obviously I'm going to have to show you some now. And I've already shown this in a different video, but my vintage skin bracer in the light bulb bottle. One of the most, I think, what's the word I'm looking for here? Probably one of the most prolific and ubiquitous mint notes, at least in America. I don't know how well Skin Bracer sells overseas, but in the United States, everyone knows this smell. Everyone recognizes this smell. Even if you don't use Skin Bracer, if you use Speed Stick, the deodorant, it's the same smell. Menon would use the Skin Bracer perfume in their Speed Stick deodorant, so it's one of those things where whether you use it or not, you've smelled it. And in Italy, we get the Proraso. It's a much more recent thing. Proraso didn't always make aftershave. They started off with soaps, and they got an aftershave only decades later, but still, this is mint with eucalyptus. So the eucalyptus really kind of mixes with that mint, and it gives you a different kind of feeling. So it's not like most other mint fragrances. And then, of course, Aqua Velva. Who can forget that? I have that in the bathroom, so I can't bring that out to you. At least I'm not going to walk away from the camera and bring it out to you. I don't think you need to see my bottle of Aqua Velva anyway, honestly. It's just Aqua Velva, guys. Nothing special. It's not even an old bottle. Now, maybe it's up here. Yeah, it's up here. One of the earliest fine fragrances to have mint. Different from an aftershave, different from a barbershop cologne, but one of the earliest actual fine fragrances to feature mint of any kind is Green Water by Jacques Fath. This is not an original 1947 bottle. Okay, I don't have one of those. This isn't a L'Oreal bottle from the 60s because I don't have one of those either. This is produced sometime in the 90s. So if it's not old enough for you, then you can go suck an egg. I don't care. This is good enough for me, and it's what you're seeing, so deal with it. Oh, you vintage gatekeepers, it has to be the oldest bottle or it's not the real deal. Well, yeah, you can go check yourself into the funny farm. We don't play that weird psychobabble shit on my channel. This is a very, very interesting fragrance because it predates things like Eau Sauvage and it predates things like Eau de Guerlain. It's stronger than a traditional cologne, but still very light and transparent. So, the way perfumer Vincent Roubert went about creating this was he used mint and he used jasmine and he used bergamot, but then he used a very large quantity of neroli, actual neroli. Now, this being a newer bottle, it probably doesn't have as much real neroli in it as those older ones did because neroli is very expensive. But the fact that this has such a high ratio of neroli to the mint in the formula, it's gives the mint a very strange sort of fresh, slightly floral tone, and it just makes the fragrance feel, it gives it the same kind of quality that you would expect from more of a Hedionne based fragrance like a Eau Sauvage or Eau de Guerlain or something that came later, but it's not using much of that. So it's almost like an older solution of the same problem, a much more expensive solution. Now, again, this being a newer bottle, I'm sure it has some actual Hedionne in it, but the way the neroli was mixed with the mint kind of acts like this booster that brings out this fresh green lift, which gives the fragrance its name. But it's just a very clever combination of materials that was an attempt to make a fragrance that felt fresh and transparent and light in 1947, during a time when they didn't have a bunch of these synthetic musk molecules and other stuff that could do that much more easily, right? Now we can do this kind of thing all day. We don't need to use high doses of weird materials or expensive materials or unorthodox combinations of materials that kind of play games when you mix them together. But, you know, like I said, perfume ingenuity was on a different level back then. These days, a lot of perfumers just have a billion materials and they have guide sheets and they have prefab combinations of molecules that they're using AI and stuff. So they have all these like little helpers. So they don't, like, half their work is cut out for them, you know, especially if they're industry perfumers, right? So it wasn't like that back then. And people who say it smells like toothpaste, I mean, if I squint, I can see it, but not really. I don't see it. At least no toothpaste I use smells like this. So. Another really interesting and unusual use of mint is this Pasha de Cartier from 1992. And this fragrance, which was perfumed by, I think, Yves Tanguy, and Jacques Cavalier was also involved with this. And, or it could be, I'm trying to think of his name. Andre something, but it was multiple perfumers though. It was multiple perfumers, and I'm sure some of you are going to say in the comment section who perfumed this for me, but I don't really have, I don't have a laptop in front of me to look at names or whatever. I didn't prepare that well, so just deal with me not knowing the name of the perfumer. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm not an encyclopedia. I don't know everything at all times. But Pasha de Cartier is a very interesting fragrance because mint is not a focus of the scent. But again, like with green water, the mint has a very envelope shaping effect on the rest of the fragrance. And in this particular case, the mint kind of does things to the spiced lavender accord in here. So it's like they took a spiced fougere similar to Jazz by Yves Saint Laurent, which came out a few years before this, and heavy on the sandalwood with spices. Oak moss is very rich, but then they worked in this mint, and this mint has this effect where it kind of sharpens everything up, it pushes it forward, but it doesn't dominate the fragrance. And sometimes people actually forget that there's mint in this, because once you get into that warm sandalwood, lavender dry down, oak moss dry down, you don't think about the mint so much, but it's there. It never really goes away. And again, it's a very clever use of the material, and I can respect it. So a few years later, I want to say 1997 or 98, I think this one is. Force Majeure by Jacques Bogart. This is an interesting fragrance because it's not one of the more popular Bogarts. For some reason, Bogart kind of fell off in the 90s. After stuff like Furio and Witness, Bogart kind of fell off. People weren't really paying too much attention to what Bogart was doing. And they released the fragrances that kind of went under the radar, like Oh Fresh. People didn't really pay much attention to that fragrance. And then this one here. Once they started to really get back into things again with Bogart Pour Homme and Silver Scent in the 2000s, they kind of turned the ship around, I guess you could say. But in the 90s, they weren't really doing it. But this fragrance is very interesting. It's almost like Bogart was looking at Jean-Paul Gaultier. They were looking at By Dolce Gabbana. They were looking at a couple other fragrances from that time period that also used mint, but they wanted to push the mint forward because, again, those fragrances used mint, but the mint was so far buried in the mix, like with Le Male, the famous Francis Kurkdjian's first big release, right, that put his career on the map, was Le Male from 1995. And with Pasha de Cartier, the mint really pushes the other materials, but it's still present. Well, with Le Male, the mint sits behind the lavender, behind the vanilla, behind the tonka, and some of the other more floral, fruity-ish materials that give Le Male that sort of strange sweetness that kicked off the whole clubber craze, right? So mint is really a background player in Le Male. It's not meant to be the star of the show. So it's like with Force Majeure, they took that structure and they turned down the vanilla almost completely. They turned up the patchouli, made it really green, really aggressively aromatic, dried it out, and then pushed the mint forward and kept the lavender, kept a couple other materials, kept the tonka, and just made this really sort of brutish kind of mint patchouli tonka fragrance. And even though it's not the most refined use of the material by any stretch of the imagination, it really does live up to its name of Force Majeure. It really is a force of nature. It really is an act of God. It just woof when you spray this stuff. And then when it dries down and you get to that patchouli and you get to that heavy aromatic base, the mint just kind of sits there like this and crosses its arms and looks at you. And again, it's not everyone's cup of tea, this one, but I want to mention it because it's unique. It's nothing if not unique, okay? Not one of Bogart's best, but now, without a doubt, one of the single strangest fragrances of any kind in my collection. I don't think I have much weirder than this. And I'm actually wearing this particular scent today, so I have extra reason to bring it up in a video. And it is L'Anarchiste by Caron. This fragrance really deserves its own video, but I've done too many Caron videos lately, so I don't want to bombard you with more Caron. I might do a individual video on this down the road. You can request it if you really want me to make a 30-minute pay-in to L'Anarchiste, but the thing about this stuff, really troubled history. The big thing about this fragrance was when it came out in 2000, it was meant to be a very new, very futuristic, very just novel, interesting fragrance. It was really house perfumer Richard Frace's like artistic achievement. He worked so hard on this fragrance, worked so long. He was really being daring and doing things differently. He wanted to make his mark with Caron, I suppose, and with the men's fragrance market in general. And it was just too bizarre. And I'll explain to you why. It uses no less than 7 different synthetic musk materials. It also has some metallic materials. Some of those come from the musk. It has a bit of like clove smokiness to it. And then it features mint, a very stark, very naked spearmint note. And the spearmint note is combined with narrowly the same way it is with the green water. So this is the second time. The second time we've seen mint and narrowly come together. So I think Richard Frace was probably looking at green water a little bit. But because of those smoky materials and those metallic materials and the musk materials, when you get that sweet orange blossom feeling mixing with the mint, and then it goes over that cold metal smoky strangeness, it gives you a very stark, almost like brutal vision of the future. And it's like the Matrix or something, or a dystopian future world. And I'm making it sound really bad, aren't I? But it is definitely something special. And the original version of the fragrance was way harsher. So it got revised and put into this bottle. And he went back and he increased the narrowly, the orange blossom, and turned down the mint a little bit, made it sweeter, rounder. And that slightly sweeter, slightly rounder version is what I have here. However, once Catalina Finance bought Caron from the Ailes Group, they very quickly discontinued this because this was Richard Frace's love child, not theirs. They didn't care. Jacques didn't really care. So they quickly got rid of this. But they recently reissued it at a much higher price point. So instead of like $50, $100, now it's $200 goddamn dollars. 75 mil. Half of this bottle for like 4 times the price. No one's going to buy L'Anarchiste at that price. So, especially not if you're used to having this in your collection. But very strange display of mint, so had to mention it. Some of you were waiting for these to come out, so if you've been locked in this long, now here's the payoff. Cartier Roadster. This fragrance made a lot of waves when it came out because it didn't get a US release at all. So, didn't get a US release. We had to import it if we wanted it. Wasn't really advertised super well either. But it was house perfumer Mathilde Laurent's first men's market fragrance for Cartier. When she took over as house perfumer, this was her first proper men's fragrance. But for some reason, it wasn't pushed very hard. It was just kind of, here it is, move on to the next. And you smell it. It's very sophisticated, very rounded. It uses mint, it uses vanilla, it uses cedarwood and patchouli. And it feels like a much drier, more mature, but also at the same time more plush and rounder version of the kind of thing that the Force Majeure was trying to do, that Lamal was trying to do. Takes out the clubber essence, takes out the bubblegum, takes out all that stuff. Leaves you with the mint, leaves you with the patchouli, adds in that dry cedarwood note, a little bit of vanilla. Not enough vanilla to make it like a bomb, but enough that it feels rounded. It gives you a sort of 1950s shaver aesthetic, which for 2008 was really weird. This wasn't going nowhere in 2008. People weren't going to buy this. And then it gets stranger. It gets stranger because in the very next year, they come out with a sport version. Like, the original didn't do that well, so they came out with a sport version because that was going to do better. And this time around, you could tell Mathilde Laurent was like looking at Jean-Claude Elena and trying to steal some of his thunder, and she made a very transparent citrus, patchouli, has a mandarin note, has a lot of herbs in here. It's like she was looking at Terre de Hermes, she was looking at Eau d'Orange Vert, and she decided in her infinite wisdom to merge the two together, to give you that transparent patchouli, cedarwood, Terre de Hermes feeling, but then put in some of the Eau d'Orange Vert with the way the citrus is handled, the way the mandarin orange is handled, the herbs, and then put a very light dusting of spearmint on top of all of that. So Eau d'Orange Vert meets Terre de Hermes with a layer of spearmint on top. And more popular than the original Cartier Roadster, but still not popular by any stretch of the imagination. I love them both, but again, not everyone's cup of tea, and they get a lot of talk, even though they're not worn all that often. You could buy these for like next to nothing for a very long time. Now they sell for a lot of money because they're discontinued and, you know, scalpers do their thing. But I cannot do a video on mint fragrances without mentioning one of the most notorious ones. If anything in this video can be likened to toothpaste, and I still don't think it's toothpaste, but if anything can be likened to toothpaste, it's this one. Dirty by Gorilla Parfum Perfumes, aka Lush. This stuff is so aggressively minty, that you would be forgiven if you mistook this for like the smell of Altoids or some kind of like breath mint of some kind, you know, those little dentine things or little icebreakers things. This is very aggressively minty, and the idea behind this fragrance was Mark Constantine had a friend who was not super good on bathing. He didn't have a great personal hygiene routine. So he concocted a fragrance that could mask his odors. So right there, that's setting you up. You're getting set up because the fragrance is designed to compensate for your lack of bathing attention. So sandalwood, lavender, what else? Oak moss, clove. It's got some neroli in it. It's got tarragon, very big, chewy, huge, sort of herbal tarragon note. And then, of course, spearmint, huge, huge, huge spearmint. And you either love this stuff, like I do, or you absolutely hate it. That's going to just about finish it off for me with mint fragrances. Some of you are going to say, hey, what about Versace Eros? Here it is, Versace Eros. I don't consider it much of a mint fragrance because I feel like the vanilla and the apple dominate after the first 5 minutes. The mint in that fragrance is really just a tease, but just so I don't get anyone complaining in the comments, there, I mentioned it. Are you happy? Of course you're not. Okay, guys, this has been my video on mint fragrances, and I'll